Okay. I'm Kathy Brinkman, and I'm joined by Joanna Hahn and Sandy Way Hazelton. And we're talking to you tonight about the role of armed personnel in our schools. So this is a special kind of meeting for our league because it's a meeting that talks about the possibility of a new position for the state league that all the local leagues would then have access to. So we thought that it would be important. Lost my controls. There we go. We thought that it would be important to review, for those who aren't familiar, how a new position gets created. So it's a very lengthy process, and it begins at the state convention, where a league or a group of leagues decides that there is a position that they would like to study. So it becomes a proposal that has to be voted on at the state convention. And so the wording is very carefully decided upon so that exactly what the study encompasses is known and agreed upon. And then there's a lot of discussion about bandwidth, whether the leagues who are taking on this work have the ability to bring it to fruition, because there have been new positions suggested or studies suggested, but then the enormous amount of work to do the research has sometimes prevented it from coming to conclusion. So there was a lot of that discussion. I was at the convention in spring of 2019 when this study was proposed. And so it was voted on, it was accepted. Not everyone was in agreement because they were concerned about the amount of work that would need to be done. So it was approved, and then it goes to the research phase. And the research phase is when the study committee forms and then comes in and looks for research and looks for valid research and meets. So they met for over a year reviewing the research that they found and discussing it and deciding what the next steps would be. And it was Hudson League that took this proposal on, this study on. So it's important to know that we have positions at the national level, and all states then and all local leagues can use those positions and act on them. We also have positions at the state level. And so at the state level, any local league can act on that position. So there's a climate position at the national league, and there are other positions at the state league. And then there are local positions that we as a local league say are important to us that really just include our local area. So this is at the state level. So at I think it was Hudson League and Dayton League and some others who agreed to form this study group. And there are educators, several educators on the study group. There's both a clinical and a social psychologist. There is a high school student, a college student, members of Moms Demand Action, and another individual who became very familiar with Buckeye Firearms Association in order to understand their perspective and who they are and what they do. So it was a large group of people, or a fairly small group of people, but covered a lot of different areas. So they met for over a year. Then they form a consensus package. They create a consensus package. And that package then has a number of questions that they decide need to be answered before they can come up with the statement of what this new position would be. And it's important because they send their key research links in that packet that we sent to all of you, plus the questions that they need answered in order to form the final wording. So all across Ohio, leagues, the local leagues, there are 29 of us, are meeting to answer these questions. And so we decided, and they recommended, that perhaps we would want to do it in 2 meetings because there's a tremendous amount of information. And we are using this meeting to present the information, to present their research, and any additional research that we have been able to do. And then a week from tonight, we will meet to answer those consensus questions. So in the intervening weeks, if you haven't had the opportunity to review the information that was sent out, then you can do so. You can do additional research on your own. And then we will answer the consensus questions. So once then we answer the questions, all of that gets sent to the state league, who forwards it back to the lead league, which is Hudson. They review it, and then they understand what how the local leagues feel about those various questions, which is a really key step, because they have to write a position that they believe first supports their beliefs, and secondly is going to be something that can be approved at the state convention. So if there's vast disagreement, or not enough agreement across the state, then the new position wording isn't going to be approved at the state convention. So again, it'll be 2 years this spring since this was proposed, and then it will be voted on. So that's what we're here to do, is to discuss the research. The 3 of us are not subject matter experts here. We are presenting the research that has been done and that we have followed on with some of our own research, but we're not subject matter experts. So, a caveat there. So that's where we're heading. This is the approved study motion, that a new study to assess the impact on the health and safety of students, school personnel, and communities when school personnel are armed while on school grounds. Rationale includes a potential increase in risk of harm if school personnel are armed. Further, school boards are allowed to arm school personnel without informing the community. Our scope would include risk of harm to students, school personnel, and communities, mishandling of firearms, training, cost, accountability, and liability issues. And then Hudson will take the lead. So this is what was voted on. This is what was approved. So that study then was broken down into these 5 categories that we'll be discussing tonight. So you see them here: decision making, who gets to decide, whether school personnel are armed, what's the cost and the liability, what kind of training and checks are there, how are weapons stored, and what are the perceptions of safety in the schools. And then one of the key elements that was in the cover letter that came to us with this packet was that they believe, Hudson, the study group believes, that environment permeates all of these questions. And so they describe environment as factors such as, is the school district suburban, rural, or city? What is the age, size, and design of the buildings? So this is, looking to safety and how do you secure a building, and, what are the characteristics of the buildings? What grades are taught there, and what kind of crowding is there? What adherence and practice of school safety plans is there? And what training would be utilized for the facility and to protect students? So that's how they approached this. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to talk about the first couple issues.
Okay, why do we even have armed personnel in schools? Well, it was certainly a response to the 2012 tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary. The Ohio School Boards Association did a white paper on school safety and security. And they emphasized that while these high-profile incidents are rare, that schools remained one of the safest places for our students. They recognized, however, that school districts certainly need to do everything to ensure the highest level of safety and security for our children. And they suggested that all the schools in Ohio develop a comprehensive plan to respond to violent incidents. Now in 2018, the shooting in Parkland, Florida, this interest resurfaced, especially at this time because the President Trump said that he favored directly using federal funds to arm teachers. And despite the disapproval of organizations like the American Federation of Teachers, Fraternal Order of Police, there were certainly many supporters, and this included our local sheriff. Chief Jones offered free concealed carry lessons to 50 school employees in Butler County, and the Buckeye Firearms Foundation also offered free training classes to teachers in our county. Now, there's no doubt that gun violence should be a major concern for all of us. I mean, approximately 2,900 children and teens were killed by weapons in 2020. 15 of those were on school grounds at the time. And the next slide there. But having armed personnel in schools is certainly controversial, and it's a departure from Ohio's traditional approach, which was keeping guns out of schools. But Ohio, as you can see, and 26 states allow this today in terms of arming students. The next slide. Despite a commonly held belief, and certainly the prevailing media narrative that our schools are threatened by active shooters, the data shows that these tragedies are really extremely rare. That according to an analysis of violence that was done in schools 2018 to 2019, and that's the newest available information, the greatest threat is not an active shooter event. What this study did was define violent incidents as those that have either disrupted classes, closed schools, or required a multi-agency response. Now, the important point here is that 1/3 of all the violent incidents that were reported in this school year were related to a high level of anxiety, basically the fear that was created that there would be the serious incidents. But in fact, bomb threats are still 60% more likely than gun threats. But analysts are most concerned that the unintended consequences of this focus on the single shooter incident, what it might mean is that schools are not as well prepared for the majority of violent incidents. The most likely things, accidents, medical emergencies, or weather events. As the graph shows, the threat assessment, in fact, is very important. What school administrators need to know is the best way to evaluate threats, basically being able to provide appropriate interventions, effective supervision so that it doesn't even happen. Now, prevention may be as easy as improving visitor management, or it can be as involved as providing armed personnel. But how do you provide such protection without creating almost a prison-like atmosphere? Now, these challenges are supposed to be addressed in the district's comprehensive safety plan. Now, Ohio state law requires that all districts have a plan. And those plans, first of all, must include law enforcement, safety officials, parents, and staff in the formation of those plans. Secondly, those plans have to be updated every 3 years. And finally, the local police are allowed to train in the schools with drills once every year. Now, Talawanda does have such a plan, and the district works closely with local law enforcement. There are drills when school is in session. And in our local school district, we do have full-time armed resource officers, but we do not arm teachers. Now, fewer than half of Ohio schools actually use resource officers, but we have no idea how many of the 610 public school districts in Ohio actually allow arms for teachers. The next slide. Now, in coming to a consensus position on arming of personnel in schools, the first question that the League of Women Voters of Ohio would like us to address is, to what extent do you feel that the state government should be involved in determining how a school district responds? In other words, should the state set the criteria or standards under which a district can decide on their policies? Now, the range might be from full freedom to decide, or the extreme would be that the state mandates who can be armed under what circumstances with what type of training. Now, certainly the argument for having the district decide is a recognition that every city, village, or county is unique. We all have different cultures, we have different values, different concerns and the needs with regard to arming personnel. And traditionally, Ohio has a strong belief in home rule. And Governor DeWine, when he was Attorney General, and in response to the white paper in 2013, believed that the decision to arm personnel was certainly best made at the local school board. On the other hand, there are even federal laws that set parameters for the use of weapons on school grounds. The Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, in fact, made it unlawful for people with loaded weapons to be within 1,000 feet of a public or private school property. And there are good reasons to feel that setting standards at the state level might be appropriate. You'd like to have consistency, transparency. You want to promote the use of experts in developing policies and procedures. And it would be very hard for a lot of districts to have the time, the resources to devote to fully and thoroughly investigating all the options that are available. And I think certainly we feel that maybe there should be the state involved in requiring approved training programs. Okay, the next slide. So the next question becomes, if the districts are to decide for themselves, how inclusive should that decision-making be for a district to decide about arming school personnel? It could go from an executive committee of the board, totally confidential, or it could be a vote at a public meeting. School boards certainly are elected and trusted to make decisions for the welfare and safety of students. And we certainly believe that it is appropriate that the details of these comprehensive plans are confidential. I mean, it's appropriate that you don't want to identify the individuals that are authorized to be armed. You don't want that made public. But the question is, should the public be included in the initial decision to provide for armed personnel in the schools? The thing is, Ohio law actually allows the local Board of Education to authorize individuals to carry firearms only by a resolution. The board could authorize a person to carry. Now, the state does require that they have a concealed carry permit. And as I mentioned before, though, we don't know how many of the 610 districts actually allow students to do, or teachers to actually carry arms. Now, some school boards have actually made this public, and they've made it quite well known. In Indian Valley, Newcomerstown, Coshocton, River Ridge, they have done this at a public vote at a public meeting. And actually, there are schools in Texas that advertise that they arm their teachers. They think that this is a good selling point for the school. On the other hand, many of these decisions have been made that the requirements for arming personnel have not been subject to community debate, and the public does not know whether teachers in their community are armed. There are currently two lawsuits before the Ohio Supreme Court that have come from the Madison School District here in Butler County. Now, one of them revolves around the violation of open meeting laws. and the respect for public participation in setting school district policies. Now, it appears that pleading for open debate, that the appeals court has ruled in favor of the parents who are suing, saying that the school district must provide open, they can't do this by just a closed executive committee. Now, the other lawsuit involves training, and Joanna's going to discuss that in more detail right soon after.
Okay. Okay, so the stakeholder views. One of the issues is, how does the community feel about this issue, and how do the people who are most central to the situation feel? So we've been asked some questions, consensus questions around stakeholder views. And so I'll say for all of these categories that there's a wealth of views. We're going to give you the opinions or the statements from the state and national level for the organizations that represent these categories, or most of these categories. But there are going to be individuals in each group who have a wealth of opinions on this. So, for example, teachers, most teachers are not in favor, and yet you're going to find teachers who are very much in favor. So having said that, that applies to all of it. As Sandy stated, for the American Federation of Teachers, and additionally the National Education Association and the National PTA reject the idea of arming school personnel. A quote from the National Education Association is this: "The idea that we can reduce gun violence in schools by bringing even more guns into schools is ludicrous and dangerous. Educators, parents, and students are demanding common sense solutions that will actually save lives." In a March 2018 survey, nearly 73% of 500 teachers opposed arming school personnel. And that survey was done by Gallup, and it surveyed teachers across the country. Of course, as I said, there are individuals who feel differently, but by and large, the majority do not, nor do the national associations that represent them. I did not know that there was a National Association of School Resource Officers. They support placing a well-trained school resource officer in every school instead of arming teachers and school personnel. But there's a significant asterisk there. If a district chooses to arm school personnel, they believe that these individuals should have training that is on par with law enforcement officers. Now, law enforcement officers are almost always, or vets, are almost always the individuals who are the SROs, the school resource officers. And the Association of School Resource Officers goes on to say that if school personnel are armed, they should be instructed not to abandon students to seek out assailants. The latter point is one that is asked quite often. What would a teacher be expected to do if he or she was armed? If an active shooter was nearby, should they leave the children in their care and seek out the shooter? Should they only shoot if the active shooter comes into their space where children are present, or something else? Law enforcement personnel. The Fraternal Order of Police of Ohio rejects the idea of arming school personnel. Of course, as Sandy stated, and as I think we're all aware, Butler County Sheriff Rick Jones is one of the local people, or another police officer, who believes differently. Now, in October 2020, the Ohio chapter of the FOP filed a brief in Ohio Supreme Court on the Madison case that Sandy was talking about. They're arguing against arming teachers, and their quote in their brief is that the policy would make an already dangerous situation even more dangerous for law enforcement, for school staff, and for the students themselves. They list 4 points in their brief that identify why they believe that this is problematic. And their first point is anyone involved in a gunfight becomes less accurate. Quote, the result will be errant bullets flying down chaotic hallways full of running children, end quote. Their second point is that teachers without sufficient training will only make things harder for officers called to the scene. Their third point is teachers lack the proper training on gun retention and, quote, by accident or by force, students will end up with the guns in their hands, end quote. And teachers without proper training will not be prepared for the decisions that have to be made in the event of a school shooting. So in Ohio, it's pretty clear that law enforcement, by and large, at the state level, is not in favor of arming personnel. Now, across students and parents, you would expect a diversity of opinion, and that is certainly the case. There are some studies that show student views. Notably, there's a March 2018 study. It has 25,000 students in 3,500 schools in all 50 states. 77% of those students favor stricter gun laws and are by and large opposed to arming school personnel. In another national study, and this was done about the same time frame, February to March 2018, again a national study. This focused on teens, 733 teens. Over 65% stated that arming teachers and school officials will make schools more dangerous. In that same study, a third of these teenagers say that they, quote, worry a lot about being the victim of a mass shooting. Now, you have to think through when mass shootings have happened and think, is this a reaction to a recent shooting? There certainly was the Parkland situation in 2018. But then there's research coming out now talking about how students felt about seeing reports of the vice president and senators and House members who are cowering in offices, barricaded by desks, and feeling as if they were in a position much like a student. And I think that the fears continue for a lot of students. And then finally, and not to be glossed over at all, there's a need to understand that people of color, whether they are teachers or students, often feel less safe when any violent situation arises in the schools, as they have the additional fear of being falsely identified as the perpetrator. This issue has become more visible after the death of George Floyd, and there have been recent reports of school administrators in some states who are asking themselves how the role of police in their schools is perceived by teachers and students of color, and wondering how to solve the competing goals of security versus intimidation and harm. Okay, so that's pretty much what we know about stakeholder views. It's not as easy to find research on how school administrators view this. And then we come to training. And this is one of the key issues that is being looked at now in Ohio. The second case that Sandy was talking about is how much training should armed personnel have, and that is the second case that involves Madison Local School District. And so you'll see on the chart here that Ohio police officers require 737 hours of training. Now, this is a minimum. It's a state mandate, state mandated minimum, and the Ohio Attorney General's office controls the training academies in Ohio. So that is the minimum that they state, but they also state that municipalities may require more training. Now, not all 737 hours are spent in gun handling and working, in violent situations, but clearly a lot more of those hours are spent than you can see further down the chart on something like the FASTER training. So the question becomes, should a person who is armed in the school be a professional law enforcement person with hundreds of hours of training, or a person who is primarily an educator with a small amount of gun training? Or should schools be allowed to have both? The Ohio police officer training, the first step if you want to be a police officer is a background check, a physical fitness check, and a drug screening before you're even qualified to begin the 737 hours. The FASTER training, that's faculty, administrator, safety, training, and emergency response. That is not the only training that there is, but it is the one that a lot of Ohio schools have used. And it is funded by the Buckeye Firearms Foundation. I was not aware that the Buckeye Firearms Association is a 501c3, and the foundation, according to their website, and I quote, is a 501c4 social welfare organization that serves as the flagship of our grassroots efforts to defend and advance the right of more than 4 million Ohio citizens to own and use firearms for all legal activities, including self-defense, hunting, competition, and recreation. BFA works to pass pro-gun legislation, educate the public through ongoing media relations, provide high-quality firearm classes, and make available a wide variety of resources for gun owners. So with the FASTER training, the first thing required is a concealed carry permit. That's 8 hours. And then 26 hours for the FASTER training. That training is a mix of gun handling and medical training for gunshot wound victims. And 200 Ohio school districts have had some number of staff attend the training. We don't know how many because, again, this is not public information. For those interested in what Madison local school requirements of their folks who are permitted to carry a gun is, those requirements are, of course, the concealed carry, and then 26 hours of training. Doesn't have to be the FASTER, but I think that that's what they have utilized. Their second requirement is that armed personnel must carry their gun at all times while in the school. And then thirdly, they're instructed not to pursue a shooter and only use their weapon as a last resort. Locally, some things have changed in the landscape of arming school personnel. After Parkland shooting, I think a lot of people know that the school resource officer did not act until police arrived, and there was a lot of criticism of that. In fact, the instructions locally in Ohio for most school districts and for Parkland were to stand down until backup arrived. After Parkland, the instructions changed, and local Lakota East High School school resource officers are now instructed to act alone and not wait for backup so that a situation does not occur again, as happened in Parkland when someone was on site. So the last thing I want to talk to you about quickly is other training such as ALICE. You may have heard about this. It's alert, lockdown, inform, counter, evacuate. And their mission is to improve chances of survival. And they do not focus on training personnel to use guns. They focus on doing whatever you need to do to survive. I watched a video of young, they were first or second grade students, and there was a training session, and the police officer was asking them, you know, it took a while to get there, but eventually he asked them what would happen if a bad guy came in. He talked to them about fires and what do? You try to get away from the fire. That's the first thing. If you can get away, you do. And that's their belief is get away, or if a shooter comes in, then attack. And so there are second graders talking about throwing staplers at the head of the active shooter. But they believe use whatever weapon is at hand. And I did take a 2-hour, very abbreviated ALICE course when I was at a state convention when I worked for Miami. And I have to say that I came home sore because we practiced chokeholds and other maneuvers in that training. So I think that it's mentioned within the study materials, so that there's the idea that there are things that we could do that are different from arming school personnel. So what might some of those things be? And in this case, the ALICE training is one of the alternatives to arming. So I'm going to turn it over now to Joanna.
Okay, I'm going to talk about management of firearms in the building. And I wanted to start off by saying that firearms started in buildings with school personnel, armed school personnel in 2008 in Texas. And they started there because of the distance. It was a rural area, and the distance to the police station was so great. So that is one of the reasonings for having armed school personnel, is if the distance to the police is a long ways and time-wise, that could be a reason, and that's how it started in Texas. As far as storage goes, concealed carry weapons can be stored on the body, in a purse, in a desk drawer, or someplace close by. But research says that guns are safest when unloaded weapons are locked and ammunition is locked in a separate location. So again, they want those in two places, two different locations. The weapon would be locked, unloaded, and locked in one location, and the ammunition would be locked in a separate location. Bulletproof vests and radios may also be hidden and locked. In this case, it would require extra time, would be needed to access those guns and ammos. Research also says that 1/3 of children at home have discovered and handled hidden guns, 40% without their parents' knowledge. So it's not fail-proof, even though they are locked. Biometric safes are one way to store guns, and they are considered a little bit safer. They require a fingerprint scan. Several fingerprints can be stored in one biometric safe, so multiple people can access it. If it does take police 4 to 5 minutes to arrive on the scene, this method could be faster than having to wait for police. Even though it could be faster, though, it does bring up other issues. Now we have more guns in the school, which could lead to more unintended instances. A child discovering a gun and gaining access. Unintentional harming of themselves or another person. In Sparta, Ohio, in 2019, the transportation director left a gun unlocked in a plastic case near her desk. She went to the bathroom and 2 first graders found it and accessed it. Other situations, there was a study done with over 90 publicly reported instances of mishandled guns at school. I'm going to give you a couple examples. A student in 2020, a student is grabbing an officer's gun while the officer attempted to subdue the student. The student overpowered them. In 2020, a firearm was left unattended in a bathroom where it was found by a student. No shots were fired. In 2019, a school district employee's firearm fell out of its holster onto a school bus seat. The firearm was later found by a student. No shots were fired. In 2019, a teacher left her gun unattended in a teacher's workroom. The teacher served as a school guardian and was authorized to have the gun. No shots were fired. In 2019, a student found a gun and bullets inside an unattended purse on a school bus. Officers determined that the purse belonged to a school bus driver employed by the school district. No shots were fired. These are just a few examples of some incidences where guns were found and possibly handled by children. Guns in buildings might also escalate what otherwise might be a low-level incident. There have been incidences where a fight or something broke out, and having the presence of a gun has actually escalated it. It's known as the weapons effect phenomena, in which simply being in the presence of a weapon can increase a feeling of aggression. The American Bar Association report in 2019 found that the NEA, the Educators Association, the National Educators Association, the Federation of Teachers, the National Association of School Resource Officers, the National Association of Secondary Principals, the National Association of School Psychologists, all opposed arming school teachers, all opposed arming school personnel. The Department of Education, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, and Justice Department with the FBI and the Federal Emergency Management jointly prepared a guide for school emergency operations plans. They make many recommendations. It does not recommend arming teachers anywhere in this plan. Law enforcement practitioners at a roundtable discussion at Johns Hopkins University identified 22 factors that an armed teacher would have to assess quickly and act upon in an active shooter situation. So that goes back to, is our training enough? Would we be able to actively make those 22 decisions quickly? In 160 active shooter cases, only one successful armed civilian intervention has occurred, and that one incident was a highly trained U.S. Marine. A study by the New York Police Department found that officers hit their target only 18% of the time. They also engaged in reflective shooting if they hear certain words. He's got a gun, or they heard gunshots. High stress situations cause police officers to the vast majority of police officers to miss their targets. And in a Dallas report found that drawing weapons in self-defense slowed the process of actually identifying the suspect in the situation. And in 1992 to 2006, 50 times as many youth shootings occurred away from school than at school. And that was a study done by the U.S. Department of Education and Justice. And then in 2012, the CDC found that only 2% of homicides to youth happen on school grounds. Okay, you want to go to the next slide? So funding of armed school personnel. The federal government defers to the states on how those funds are used. Some of the costs behind it are the cost of materials: safes, guns, vests, ammunitions, cameras, radios, the training we talked about, the firearm itself, the defense tactics, the gunshot first aid, the ongoing education, and the insurance. One school district paid $1,200 per person to train. One school district in Ohio spent $70,000 on safes, bulletproof vests, cameras, guns, radios, and ammunition. A uniformed armed officer costs $200,000 a year and $100,000 a year for insurance for its staff with access to firearms. The unknown cost is the cost of liability. So what happens if a school district is sued? Is the Board of Education liable? Is the teacher liable? So the unknowns: can the district get insurance? Will it go up simply because some schools have and are allowed to have armed personnel in the school? Can they afford it if their school so chooses to arm their personnel? Will there be that general increase then in those state premiums? Will the Board of Education be covered if something unintentional happens? Will a teacher be covered if something unintentional happens? Will a teacher be found to have acted in bad faith? Will parents sue? Will a Board of Education have to pay for teacher defense? part of their employment duties? It might be considered part of their employment duties. Will a Board of Education be sued for failure to train that teacher properly? Will teachers be provided gun or carry their own? Who will buy it? Who will pay the continued education, as we said? And then will psychological testing be required and continue to be throughout the amount of time that they use to carry the gun? So these are all things that could lead to possible lawsuits and possible funding issues or costs that are unknown to the districts. And that's all I've got.
Okay. Okay. So we're interested in knowing what your questions are. So you can raise your hand and I will unmute you, or there aren't that many of us. I could actually open up video to everyone. How's everyone feel about that?
Sure.
Okay, hang on. If you don't want your video to show, if you decided to be casual tonight, then feel free to turn off your video. I'm promoting everyone to panelist, and gosh, I hope it helps. I hope it works, because so far it's not.
Oh, there we go. There's Jenny.
Okay. Okay. So I think we have everyone now as a panelist so that we can see you and we can talk.
I just want to let you know, this is my husband's computer. He's sitting here. He's a former superintendent, so he has a lot to say about the topic.
Wow. Yeah, glad to have you.
He liked your information, I'll tell you that. So anyway.
Yeah, what a very difficult topic. I mean, I think we've all struggled, with this topic because it's so hard to think about a shooter in a school to begin with, much less what do you do to protect.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Does anyone have any questions about any of the material or anything that we didn't present that would help you understand where we're headed? Because we've got 10, I think it's 10 consensus questions to answer a week from tonight. We are recording this so that members who were not able to attend tonight can watch it if they like.
Is there any data, or what data do they show for the legislature, for the decision made by the legislature? Is there any data that they used to formulate that decision? Because I didn't hear much support in your presentation for that decision. I'm just curious what numbers they used, other than, say, well, we want them to be safe, but who says that this is going to work? I'm just curious what data they
You mean
use.
the loophole in Ohio law that allows?
I mean, yes, that now in Ohio, teachers can carry guns provided but that came out of the state, given that authority for the districts to decide, correct?
I don't think it's new though. It's not.
No, it's not new, but I'm just curious how it even, given the data that you presented, what basis did they, in hindsight, what did they use historically to make those decisions?
I don't know. Do you know, Sandy or Joanna?
No, I think what the response is that it was left up to each school district what they would like to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the only, the loophole was that you could circumvent the federal legislation about not carrying a loaded weapon into a safe zone.
Mhm.
Right,
So
because the Ohio loophole, it does then
it allows them.
the federal law that you can't have a gun.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and like I said, in Texas, it started because the one rural district was too far from the police station. So that's, that's how it started there with, I guess that was the rationale.
Uh-huh. I found it interesting because we're familiar with the Wisconsin schools as well, and they were one of the states that don't allow it, and they are very, very heavy into the hunting and guns and gun rights and so forth. And I thought that was interesting how the different states react
Mhm.
to it. When you looked across the map, it was all over the country.
Yeah. Well, and it's different districts. It's not even, that's the thing. It's not just statewide.
Hmm.
Yeah, but when you look at it nationally too, that map was very telling, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yes.
When you see the mix, it's almost 50-50,
Mhm.
for allowing versus not allowing, or some amount of allowance for
That's okay.
guns.
That's okay.
This is Rich Druis. I did think of a question. Did you run across any criteria that school districts are using to identify which teachers would be allowed to carry a gun? Because I think if you've spent much time around faculties, there are some teachers that you would definitely not want to be armed. And what do you do if they want to be? And the other question is, I'm really surprised that the Ohio School Boards Association has not surveyed the districts in Ohio about their policies about guns, and you would think they would have collected some information.
Well, Madison has not been at all transparent, so they're not a good, yardstick for what criteria they used. I don't know about the others.
Hmm.
I know that they were all volunteers. I mean, they didn't force anyone to do it, that they were all volunteers, all the people who did choose to do it. I don't know if they had to do any psychological testing or any other testing, to show that they were capable or mentally stable or anything like that. But I do know that they were volunteers.
So there are resource officers in the Talawanda School District in all the buildings, including the elementary?
Yes,
And they're armed?
yes,
Mhm.
yes, they're police. It used to be that there were shared resource officers. I'm not sure that we're not in the first year of there being one for each building. They used to be shared across a couple buildings, if I'm remembering correctly, but I think it was this year that they assigned one or hired one for each building.
Yeah, to answer Rick's question, that in fact was one of the concerns because the school boards are the ones that are responsible for deciding which teachers are armed. And so the question is, have they set up criteria or standards? And again, they're allowing that each board makes that decision themselves. This is one of the things that League is concerned about.
Yeah, and I would say that school board members may or may not be at all well informed about the characteristics of individual teachers.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I do know that some of the articles talked about that they did not recommend giving teachers a bonus for doing this, that there should be no pay incentive for doing it.
Crossing guard.
You want to tell your story? Rich, go ahead and tell them.
Well, when I was doing personnel in a school district, one of the most difficult positions to fill was crossing guard. And we had an ad in the paper one time, and I received a phone call from someone who was interested. And I thought, well, okay, maybe we can get a crossing guard here. His first question was, do I get a gun?
Oh,
You know what crossing guards are with the sign?
yeah. And you need a gun, why? Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that's my concern in this case, is that some people might want to carry a gun for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
In England, they're called lollipop ladies.
Yeah. I can
They
see
hold
that.
up the.
But parents are not allowed to carry guns into the school or visitors or anything, right? Am I correct in that?
Not
That they-
into, but there's an interesting loophole. There's an interesting loophole to the loophole. And that is that if you're a parent in a car in the school pickup line, you're okay. You're on school grounds,
Yes.
but you're okay. You can have a gun, if it's a legal gun, if you're, permitted. So the school pickup line, no problem, even though you're on school grounds.
Or the same would be if you were parked in the parking lot or whatever, as a teacher, you could have your gun in your car. Probably, correct?
Think so,
Probably.
yes. Yeah. I think so.
I don't know. As an early childhood educator, it can be very frightening. You do feel, I know when they first started locking the front door, then the parents couldn't go to the door of the classroom. Then the brother and sister couldn't walk the little guys to the classroom. And I've been during a lockdown, real one and a practice one, in a closet with kindergarten children. And the things that kindergarten children have seen with guns, they have seen them in their home. They've seen them. They know people. I was in more of an urban setting, but they know a lot more about it than I do. And they're very frightened. They're very, very frightened.
Yes.
I'm trying to, they're not supposed to talk in there, but it just got to be this like, and then it was this story sharing, because it's so heavy on their minds. You can't keep them quiet. So it's a very troubling time.
My youngest grandchild was terrified at her first lockdown. School, you don't have to say active shooter. I mean, they know it's a bad guy. That's what we're practicing. And she was terrified.
Yeah.
And she's bold. She's very bold. But something about it really got to her. And, it's very hard to talk to kids about this topic.
Mm-hmm. It really is. So you said it gets evaluated every 3 years. Well, Madison's has been in for at least 3 years, correct? I guess they've reevaluated it and kept it. Hasn't it been in there for 3 years, the policies up in Madison?
I have not heard that. I don't know.
It came in right after that shooter that they had up, the family shooting.
Right. Right. But I didn't think that was even 3 years ago, was it?
I don't know. It's been a while.
It may have been. It may have been. Yeah.
I don't look for the number of schools to decrease. I hate to be a pessimist, that have either the resource officers or rules for teachers to carry. I don't look for that to go down anytime soon, unless maybe the change of administration might help it.
Mm-hmm. I think the real question here on the table is is armed school personnel. That is what the consensus study is about the arming and who decides, and should the community be involved, and where should the funding come from, and what's the impact on the community and students. But yes, I think the school resource officers are very much going to continue.
Right.
Yeah.
I would assume the individual districts also can set the rules for like weapon security, and whether a teacher, I heard one district said they had to carry the gun on them all the time.
That's what, yes, I was surprised when I found the Madison local school rules for their armed personnel. Their rule is that they have to have it on them at all times when they're in school.
That's certainly a concern, because almost any high school teacher, if they've taught for more than a couple of years, has gotten into the middle of a student fight, and having a gun on the teacher's person is really concerning at that point.
Yeah, I totally agree. The one piece of research that I was reading was talking about how many times students have been in a teacher's desk or purse.
Oh.
That is not, as unusual as you might think.
Mhm.
Well, that's another thing that I thought of. Even if you have it locked in a desk drawer, key security is another thing, because teachers' keys are legendary for being left on a desktop, being left in a workroom, in the cafeteria, or given to a student to go to another room to get something. Keys are not secure.
Yeah. Teachers have a lot to worry about, I think. I mean, they have a lot of responsibility.
Absolutely.
One of the other pieces that I saw too, thinking about those 22 factors or decisions that you might have to make, whether to use your gun or not, also talked about how teachers are nurturing, that's their nature. Their first instinct is to not, want to hurt or harm someone. For most teachers, it's a nurturing instinct. So, how that plays into it as well.
All right, any other comments or questions? Here's Jackie. What about other alternatives considered as part of school safety plan, technology related safety measures, not just guns?
And certainly, I think there's a lot of that in place with the school emergency plans, that there's oftentimes there's one entrance, you might have to hit an intercom to go in. So I do think all those things are in play. I mean, that's just not part of, I guess, what we're studying here, but.
I think what she might be referring to is sort of the bullying, the social media. One of the things that they were concerned about is, 1/3 of these incidents are threats as opposed to actually happening, but the threat spurs on the fear, the control, the prison-like atmosphere, because people are afraid, and the threats can be pretty devastating, and kids are just using them. So how can you stop that? How do you identify that to prevent?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments or questions from anyone?
I don't want to put Linda Boardman on the spot. Hi, Linda. I'm Sandy. We've been communicating. Were you at the board meeting, or were you present at all with the rationale when it was presented about the Talawanda schools, as far as the resource officers and the rationale for hiring them for every building and all?
No, I don't remember that. I don't remember how, that might have been before I started attending full time.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And by the way, I just looked up how time flies. The Madison school shooting was 5 years ago. Yes, it was
Wow.
March of
Thought so.
2016.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So,
Wow.
but no, Sandy, I don't remember that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, your experience as a teacher, how would you stopped teaching before this became a major problem? But
Yeah, I've had a small camera stolen out of my purse that was also in a drawer, in my desk. I mean, I just don't, it's very hard for me to imagine that it would be problem free in terms of students getting their hands on the weapon. I've also been in the middle of, this wasn't at Talawanda, but 2 large 6th grade girls fighting, and in the middle, I mean, if I had had a gun, even like in a holster or something, I just, I can't imagine it being safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah.
Scary. All right. Well, we hope we see you all next Wednesday to help us answer the consensus questions so that we can have, responses back to the Ohio League. I mean, the more people who think through these questions and help us answer them, the better. So, so we'll be back at 7 o'clock Wednesday, February 3rd, to review those questions, and we'll answer them with whoever's here and get them off so that we can answer Hudson's study questions.
Okay, where does it go from there? Then they take it, the state takes it to Columbus, or?
Well, I think the answers go back to state, who gives them to the study group. The study group then looks at, there are 29 leagues, local leagues in Ohio. There's a couple others forming. They told me at the state office, but there's 29. So they look at all 29 responses. So if you think about the fact that they have to put a position together that reflects what they believe as a study group, plus can be passed at the state convention. So they'll take the answers and say, okay, what do people across Ohio think, about this issue? And so what should we say our position is? So they'll use, it's 10 questions about various aspects. They'll use those responses to form like draft wording. And then that wording of the proposed position will go to the convention. Now we'll know about it ahead of time. All the local leagues will have a chance to review it before convention, so that we, can talk, with our members as to whether we agree with that position or don't agree. And then it's discussed at convention. My understanding from what I've read is it could be amended, but I don't know how often any of that occurs. We don't have new positions come up, constantly. But it'll either be voted for or against. And if it doesn't pass, then it won't be a new position. And if it passes, then we'll be able to cite it and act on it as a local league, as will all the leagues in Ohio. So that's the process. Okay, I think we're done. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 Let's stop recording.